How are you doing, students from Chongqing? My name is Glenn. When I was in Chongqing last summer, I learned how to write my name in Chinese. Glenn. So I am Glenn. I am so excited to teach you this year. I'm very looking forward to every aspect of it, and I only wish I could be in China with you this year, but I look forward to meeting you all when you come to New York after, or when I come to China the following year, because this situation in the world is definitely going to get better. So this is a course titled Evolution and the Human Experience. Evolution and the Human Experience. So this is a course that is based on the idea of evolution, which is a theory of how life formed and why life forms exist, why there are plants, why there are insects, why there are animals, and so forth. And taking those ideas about evolution and applying them to what it means to be human like you and me. A lot of people think that evolution is mostly about fossils and DNA. A lot of people, when they hear about this class, get a little confused because they think, and they were taught, that evolution only has to do with fossils, old bones of humans or other animals or of plants, of other life forms, and DNA or genes or genetics, which is the what's in each of our cells, which is a blueprint for what an organism like a human is like. But in the last, I'd say, several years, there's been a lot of work trying to understand what it means to be human from an evolutionary perspective. And so that's what this class is about. But first, I will give an example of evolution. So here's an example of evolution. In the United States, where I am now, I often give an example related to seeds from a maple tree. The producer of this, by the way, is my daughter, Megan. And Megan, I'm going to ask you if you could look out the window and show them the maple trees. Those are maple trees. And they have a very special seed that is a very good example of evolution. Last year, when I tried to use the example of maple seeds, a very nice student raised her hand and said, that's not a common tree here. And so I stopped using that example, and I now use a Chinese peppercorn tree to think about. Because I know that you have these trees in China. In fact, I remember seeing a lot of them when I was there last year, and I find them fascinating. Here's why they're a very good example of evolution. If you see a peppercorn tree, there are two features of the tree that I find beautiful and fascinating. One, you probably know that they have thorns. So if you grab the peppercorn tree, it hurts and you will be bleeding. So you don't want to grab a peppercorn tree. There's something else interesting in the peppercorn tree, is the peppercorn, which is very spicy and is sometimes used in hot pot, which is my favorite food, by the way. If you don't think about evolution, you just see the tree and it is interesting. But if you're thinking about evolution, you ask the question, why? So evolution requires asking why. If you are an evolutionary scholar, you won't just look at the tree and say, that's nice. You'll look at it and you'll ask, why does it have thorns like that? Why does it have these peppercorns? What function? What is the function of the thorn? And then you can ask the related question, what is the function of the hot peppercorn? What is the function? That question, what is the function, is a variant or an example of asking this question of why. What is the function of the thorn? So now we're going to take that question. I keep kicking my shoes out. We're going to take this question, these two questions, and reframe them a little bit. When we ask the question of what is the function, we are kind of asking, what is the function for the tree? Or what is the function in terms of how does it help the tree? So that phrase, what is the function, translates into this question of how does this feature help the tree to survive or to reproduce? Okay, now this question is really getting at the way that an evolutionary thinker will think about any life form. We look at the features or the details of the life form, whether it be a peppercorn tree, whether it be an ant, a bug, an insect, whether it be another kind of plant, whether it be a mammal, like a rat or a mouse or a pig. We look at the features of it and we can ask, what is the function? What is the function of every single part of it? What is the function of the leaves of the tree? The leaves of the tree help bring energy for the tree through the process of photosynthesis. Okay, so you probably already know that. That's like the purpose of leaves from a biological perspective. But everything else about the tree also is part of its evolutionary history. So everything about the tree, all of the features of the tree require us, beg us to think about why. What is the function? How does this feature help the tree to survive or reproduce? Let's start with the thorns. If I were there in person, right now, I would say raise your hand if you can try to explain why the peppercorn tree has thorns. I'm not there in person, so I will save that for our discussion, which we will have in a little bit. But let's ask that question, what is the function of the thorn? Right? Well, I don't like touching thorny bushes. In fact, just this morning, I went running, because I like to run every morning, and I found myself having to get out of a gate, and there was a rose bush that was overgrown. And rose bushes, like peppercorn trees, have thorns. And I'll give you the short version of the story. I wasn't able to go through that one spot where I wanted to go through because there were too many rose bushes and too many thorns, and I would have been bloody from here to here and scratched up. So the thorn affected my behavior. The thorn kept me away from the tree or from the bush. The thorn made me, as another animal in the woods, as another organism in the woods, say, I'm gonna go somewhere else. I'm not gonna bother fighting with that rose bush. Think about peppercorn trees. A long time ago, the ancestors of modern peppercorn trees, one of them by random chance, and I know that you're gonna learn about mutation and selection and all these processes, but one peppercorn tree a long time ago, by a genetic mutation, grew a thorn. And that thorn gave that peppercorn plant a small advantage. So if you think about two similar peppercorn plants, one has a thorn and one does not, and there are animals in the environment, which one is the animal going to gravitate toward? If there is an animal that eats plants, called an herbivore, so an animal coming through the forest, you can just picture an ancestral animal who's looking for a treat. So I don't even know what kind of animal that is, but that animal is really hungry and only eats plants, and it sees this tree and this tree. Which one is it going to eat? It's going to be better off eating the one with no thorn. Therefore, this tree is less likely to survive, and it is less likely to reproduce compared with this tree. So the next generation we will have more thorns because the thorn is adaptive. And the ones without thorns are going to get eaten. Goodbye. And the next generation, let's say you have a peppercorn tree that has 4 thorns, and then you have another one that has a lot of thorns. The one that is more likely to reproduce and survive is the one that is more likely to have a high number of thorns. So the thorn, then, even though we don't like it, and if you're picking peppercorns off your peppercorn tree in your garden, the thorns are not your friends. The thorns can hurt you, but from the perspective of the peppercorn tree, the thorns are brilliant. The peppercorn tree, if it could think, which it can't, but if it could think, it would say, I love the thorns. And now, when you have peppercorn trees all over Chongqing, they are covered with thorns. That's because the ancestors of that tree that had thorns were more likely to survive and reproduce because they were less likely to get eaten. What I love about the peppercorn tree is they have two great defensive adaptations. And this is why I think it is such a good example. Because you can imagine some herbivore, some animal a long time ago that ate peppercorn trees and that had a digestive system so that it could eat thorns. The peppercorn tree's evolution tells a story where it needed a second adaptation. And that's exactly what happened over evolutionary time. At some point, one tree by random chance, based on genetic mutation, suddenly had a little peppercorn seed pod. And if you have ever eaten one directly, you know that they can add flavor to food, but you don't want to eat one by itself because it is hot, it is unpleasant, and it has a small amount of toxins. If you eat a whole bunch of fresh peppercorns without eating anything else, that might be difficult, that might be unpleasant. That's for us, and that's also true for the herbivores that eat things like peppercorn trees. Think about this. Millions of years ago, or thousands of generations ago, there were two kinds of peppercorn trees. One with thorns, and one with thorns and that little random peppercorn. Any herbivore that eats that peppercorn is going to have a bad meal. Across a lot of time, the tree with no peppercorn dies out because the tree with the peppercorn, and then with more peppercorns, becomes more likely to survive and reproduce. This is why I love the Chinese peppercorn tree. It is a great example of evolution in action. I'm going to leave that guy right there. Meg, how much time do we have?
26 minutes.
Okay, thank you. So, here's different ways that we can think about the peppercorn tree. The thorns and the peppercorns are evolutionary adaptations. They are adaptations. The word adaptation has several different meanings, but in terms of evolution, it has a very specific meaning. An adaptation is a feature of an organism of an organism that helps the organism to survive and or reproduce. So an adaptation, two words, an adaptation is a feature or a detail of an organism that helps that organism to survive and or to reproduce. The thorns help the peppercorn tree to survive. The trees that had the peppercorns and the thorns were left alone, and they could grow and they could survive, and those peppercorn seeds would eventually fall and plant new peppercorn trees. So it would reproduce. An evolutionary scientist thinks about features of an organism that help that organism to survive and or to reproduce. So a very important concept in this class, which we will revisit several times, is the idea of an adaptation. There are some related concepts that we will get into in more detail, but adaptation is a very core idea. When you understand the idea of adaptation, you can look at any organism, including humans, and start to understand why different features evolved in the first place. So understanding the idea of adaptation helps us to understand why any feature of an organism evolved and became what we call species typical. There's kind of a fancy term, species typical. Species typical means that it is typical or common among different members of the species. In humans, bipedalism, the fact that we walk on two legs, is species typical. In humans, the fact that we have two eyes is species typical. In peppercorn trees, the existence of thorns on the branches is species typical. If you have a dog at home, or if you have a cat at home, we have two dogs, by the way. If you have a dog or a cat, they have a tail. The tail is species typical. Understanding this idea of adaptation helps us to understand why any feature of an organism evolved and became species typical. The idea of adaptation relates to some other concepts. It relates to the idea of natural selection. Natural selection is Charles Darwin's big idea. So this is Charles Darwin's big idea. It is the process by which evolution happens. It is how evolution works to create the beautiful diversity in life that exists all around the globe. Natural selection is a phrase that relates to adaptation. Natural selection is the process that creates adaptations. Natural selection is the process that creates adaptations. Natural selection works on what are called selective pressures. So here's kind of a short version of natural selection. In a population of any kind of organism, there are selective pressures in the environment. There are two phrases for this. There are what we call sometimes adaptive hurdles, I'm going to write or, okay, so we call them adaptive hurdles or selective pressures. In the environment that impede or that stop survival or reproduction. So this is a really short subset of the idea of natural selection. In a population of any organism, there are adaptive hurdles or selective pressures. These are things that get in the way of survival or reproduction. That animal that eats plants is an adaptive hurdle that gets in the way of the peppercorn trees surviving and reproducing. Adaptations, or an adaptation, is an evolved solution to an adaptive hurdle. So now we can think of what an adaptation is in the idea, or in the context of the idea of natural selection. An adaptation is an evolved solution. The adaptive hurdle is the problem. There are herbivores in the environment. That is a problem. The adaptation is the development across evolutionary time of thorns and peppercorns. A thorn is an adaptation for the plant. A peppercorn is an adaptation for the plant. It evolved because it helps address or solve an adaptive hurdle, which is also called a selective pressure. Adaptations are good for the organism. They help the organism survive. They help the organism reproduce. So adaptations are simply due to math selected naturally or by nature. So if you ever wonder, where does the idea of natural selection come from? This is the essence of the idea of natural selection. Adaptations are simply, due to math, selected by nature. If you have 3 peppercorn trees that have no thorns, and you have 100 peppercorn trees that have thorns and peppercorns, the next generation you will have even more peppercorn trees that have the adaptations of thorns and peppercorns. And so those adaptations will become more common in the future. They are selected naturally, and the ones that don't have the thorns or the peppercorns will be selected against. So their numbers will decrease. That's what I mean by due to math. So adaptations are naturally selected. They are selected by nature to exist into the future. So you might be thinking, that is kind of interesting, but this is a course about evolution and the human experience, not about evolution and peppercorn trees. I use that example to put a face to what adaptations and evolution are all about. Let me get one final concept related to adaptation, and then I will slow down and talk about a human behavioral example. One more concept is the concept of reproductive success. What we sometimes call RS. RS, or reproductive success, is the ability of an organism to ultimately reproduce. So reproductive success is ultimately the ability of an organism to reproduce. If an organism has adaptations that have passed natural selection, then that organism is more likely to have those adaptations and then to be able to survive and then to be able to reproduce. So when we think about evolution, I like to say this, that with evolution, survival is a detail. A lot of people don't have this understanding of evolution, but if you do, you'll get it. Survival is a detail. It's a very important detail. Without survival, you will never reproduce. But survival is a tool that helps with reproduction. Survival is a detail. Survival helps with reproduction. Survival helps with reproductive success. So, reproductive success, thereby, is what we call Darwin's bottom line. Reproductive success is really Darwin's bottom line. An adaptation that helps with survival, but that does not help with reproductive success, will not make it into the future. An adaptation that helps with survival and with reproductive success will make copies of itself into the future, because reproductive success is the process by which an adaptation makes it into the future, by the process of genes that code for different adaptations. I'll give you a human example. Evolution applied to humans. Okay. I'll give you a, there's a lot of examples I could give. People across the world display emotions using similar facial expressions. Okay, let's think for a minute about this idea. There's a lot of research going back for years showing that people across the world display emotions using the same facial expressions. When I first taught in China a few years ago, I learned quickly that while the students were very, very smart, sometimes it was hard for them to understand the language. And when I would email them or use WeChat, sometimes students didn't always understand. But students, and maybe you do this, use a lot of emojis. And I learned quickly that emojis helped me to communicate to my students. And it helped the students, such as you guys, communicate back to me so that I can understand. If I write a message to you on WeChat, and I end the message with the smiley face, that means everything is good. Everything is good. If I write a message to you and on WeChat, and it ends with that face, I don't know what you would think. You would think, wow, this guy doesn't know what's going on. He is confused. He does not know how to feel. If I wrote an email to you or a message to you on WeChat and it ended with this face and it had a little tear, you'd say, oh, Glenn is sad, right? Even though we grew up on opposite sides of the world, even though I live in New York and you live in Chongqing, it turns out that the basic emotions that human beings like you and me experience are very similar across the entire globe. The human emotional experience seems to be the product of evolution. So we can think of human emotions as a product of evolution. There was a very big study in the 1960s by a guy named Paul Ekman. He was a very famous behavioral researcher. And Paul Ekman did a very smart study. he had photographs, pictures of people from two places. So the subjects or the participants were from either A, the USA, or B, New Guinea. So there's the globe, and here is America, and I guess I should have put more space for China. And here is Asia over here, it's Japan over here, and here in the Pacific Islands is New Guinea. And Paul Ekman did a very smart study where he showed photographs of American college students making a facial expression. And he said, make a happy face. And they made a happy face, and he took a picture. And he said, make an angry face. And they made an angry face, and he took a picture. And he said, make a sad face. And they made a sad face, and he took a picture. And they took those pictures from the United States, and they got them on a plane. This was before the internet. And brought them all the way to New Guinea. A very different culture. And they took the pictures out of the envelopes and showed them to people in New Guinea who never met anyone from the United States. And they showed them the pictures and said, what emotion do you see here? The people in New Guinea guessed with almost 100% accuracy. So in other words, they accurately guessed the emotions in the photos of Americans. Their guesses were almost perfect. And there was a second part. In the second part of the study, they asked people in New Guinea to make a happy face, or an angry face, or a sad face. And they took those pictures, and they brought those pictures back to the United States. And they took them out of the envelope, and they showed them to American college students, and said, what emotion do you see here? And the American college students guessed the faces of the people from New Guinea, whom they'd never met, almost perfectly, with almost 100% accuracy. Which raised the question, so Paul Ekman said, if human emotions are that visible, are that easy to detect across populations, across the entire world, they are species typical, and they must be adaptive. So now we can think of human emotional expression expressions are adaptations. This was Paul Ekman's big idea. And if they are adaptations, they must serve a function. So then he started asking questions like an evolutionary scientist. What is the function of happiness? What is the function of sadness? What is the function of anger? What is the function of disgust? What is the function of surprise? And because he thought like an evolutionary scientist, new research started coming out asking all of these questions. And it turns out that we can understand happiness as an adaptation. People do things, and if it makes them happy, they are more likely to do it. What makes you happy? Eating hot pot with friends. I've learned in Chongqing that makes people happy. I know it makes me happy. If you're out eating hot pot with friends, you have food. So being happy eating food keeps you eating food, which helps you survive. If you're happy being with a group of friends eating hot pot together, which is my favorite, by the way, that helps keep you connected to other people so that you have friends and you have other people who help you, support you in your life, and that will help you survive and maybe reproduce at a future point. What is the function of sadness? When people are sad, it's often because something bad happened in their world, but something bad from an evolutionary perspective, something that gets in the way of their ability to survive, something that gets in the way of their ability to reproduce. Think about things that make you sad and think about them as an adaptation. And suddenly we can start understanding a lot of things about the human experience with a lot of clarity because we can think like an evolutionary scientist. This has been Evolution with Glenn.